terrific. Lisa Hajjar is a political sociologist and legal scholar. She teaches at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Earlier this month, she returned to California from one of her many trips in recent years to the U.S. Naval Base at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. She's been a steady observer of trial proceedings at Gitmo, focusing among a number, but focusing in particular on the case of Omar Ahmed Hajjar, who was taken prisoner by U.S. forces at the age of 15 and who was convicted at the end of this October after 7 years of detention. Lisa Hajjar's numerous influential publications include her 2005 book, Courting Conflict, the Israeli Military Court System in the West Bank and Gaza, as well as Human Rights, Critical Concepts in Political Science, volumes 1 through 5, which she co-edited with Richard Falk and Hilal Elver. In addition, Lisa Hajjar has chaired the editorial committee of the Middle Eastern Report, which, if you're not familiar with it, is really one of the most important sources of information about the contemporary Middle East that we have available to us. It's a pleasure to welcome her here to speak to us today. Her talk today is titled, The Liberal Ideology of Torture, a Critical Examination of the American Case. Lisa, thank you.
Well, thank you all very much for being here on such a beautiful Southern California day, and thanks especially to Dan for inviting me and bringing me down to the southern end of Southern California. So today I'll be talking about the liberal, as he said, the liberal ideology of torture. And we have a perfect example of the liberal ideology of torture from our former President George Bush, who in recent days has put American torture back in the news again as he flax his new memoir, Decision Points. On November 8th, NBC interviewer Matt Lauer questioned Bush about authorizing waterboarding, to which Bush responded, "Damn right." My colleague Richard Falk characterizes this admission of criminality as an uncoerced confession. Waterboarding is torture, and torture is a crime. In fact, torture is not just any run-of-the-mill crime, it's a gross crime under international law, in the same company with war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity. What does it say about the state of American democracy when a former president can proudly and publicly admit to conspiring in the commission of a gross crime and face no risk of criminal consequences? Dahlia Lithwick pithily assesses the implications of Bush's uncoerced confession. She writes, "We keep waiting breathlessly for someone, somewhere, to have a day of reckoning over the prisoners we tortured in the wake of 9/11, without recognizing that there is no bagman to be found, and that therefore we are all the bagman." There are three we's in Lithwick's quote. The first we is we who advocate the rule of law and legal accountability for the crime of torture, whom I like to refer to as the rule of law restoration crowd. Although crowd is an overstatement, it's a small but dedicated assortment of elite intellectuals and persons of conscience. The second we refers to we, the United States, that is our representative government. And the third, the bagman for torture, is we Americans. Now let me just play you a little bit of the segment of the interview so you can hear Bush himself describing what I am referring to the liberal ideology of torture.
That's you. And I believe we're developing tools within the Constitution to do so. Some people in this country want to get rid of them, and they're wrong. They're wrong. You can't expect me and people in this government to do what we need to do to protect you and your family if we don't have the tools that we think are necessary to do so.
And you said within the law, and yet you admitted that there were these CIA secret facilities.
So what? Why is that not within the law?
The head of Amnesty International says secret sites are against international law.
Well, we disagree with him. And plus, my job is to protect you. And most American people, if I said that we had who we think's the mastermind of the 9/11, they would say, why don't you see if you can't get information out of them without torturing them, which is what we did.
Were you made personally?
My job is to protect this country, man. And I'm going to, within the law. And it gets second-guessed all the time by people who don't live in the United States. But let me remind you, September the 11th for them was a bad day. For us, it was a change of attitude.
These alternative methods you talked about in terms of extracting information from these suspected terrorists, were you made personally aware of all of the techniques that were used, for example, against the Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and did you approve all of those techniques?
I told our people, get information without torture, and was assured by our Justice Department that we were not torturing.
It's been reported that with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, he was what they call waterboarded.
I'm not going to talk about techniques that we use on people. One reason why is because we don't want the enemy to adjust. The American people need to know we're using techniques within the law to protect them. You said to me, how can we be assured you're doing everything it takes to protect the American people? And I'm saying to you, we're listening to Al-Qaeda, they're calling this country, and some people want to get rid of that program. We have walls that do not allow criminal investigators and intelligence forces to talk to each other. We've eliminated the laws. Let me finish. But one of the best source, according to those who are on the front lines of protecting the American people, is when we pick up somebody off of a battlefield, that we interrogate them within the law to get data. And I would strongly urge people to look at that speech I gave, because I declassified classified information to show how important the information we got from whom we think is the mastermind of the September the 11th attacks.
We did it for you. You're welcome. Torture produced intelligence that kept America safe. You're welcome. And what we did isn't torture because our lawyers said so. You're welcome. Now, the liberal ideology of torture is a nonsensical concept because torture is inherently illiberal. Yet just because something is nonsensical doesn't mean it's not real, as Bush so freshly demonstrates. Let's begin with the concept of liberal ideology, which has three components. One is the representative state, of which political democracy is the idealized form. That is, state power derives from the people. Two, the law regulates and limits the power of the liberal state. The alternative is tyranny or authoritarianism. And three, the liberal state is expected to act lawfully in devising policies to govern and protect its people. When it comes to foreign threats to national security, the applicable laws are international. While the United States is an outlier among liberal democracies in terms of its signing the international laws, it is a signatory to the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and the UN Convention on Torture. Now, many states engage in torture, but only liberal states invoke a liberal ideology to rationalize their torture as necessary for the greater good. The liberal ideological rationalization posits torture, euphemizes, non-torture, as necessary for the greater good. The liberal ideological rationalization posits that we need to do what we do in order to protect an innocent and vulnerable society. It is conceived and practiced as a means to an end, the end being the security of the nation. Now, torture in the context of war compares to other aspects of warfare, since both are forms of state violence directed at enemy others. However, torture is a very distinct kind of harm. It pertains explicitly and exclusively to the purposeful harming of a person who is in custody, but has not been found guilty of a crime. All lawful, painful punishments are by definition not torture, because they're lawful. I have argued elsewhere, and I will argue here, that the right not to be tortured is the most important right of all. Not because torture is necessarily the worst thing that can happen to people, and that's somewhere the useless debate, but rather because the prohibition of torture imposes a legal limit on the rights and discretion of the state in its treatment of human beings. The right not to be tortured is foundational to the rise of modern liberal democracies. Three factors make the right not to be tortured unique. First, the prohibition is absolutely non-derogable because the law recognizes absolutely no exceptions, including in times of war or national emergency. There is no right to torture. Second, the prohibition of torture is a jus cogens norm under customary international law, which means that it is applicable everywhere in the world. And third, the right not to be tortured extends to all people, regardless of their social status, political identity, or affiliation. Thus, it is an unparalleled and ideal right, comparable only in its universality to the right not to be enslaved. In contrast, the right to life is not comparably universal or non-derogable. There are many ways in which people can be lawfully killed. In the context of any kind of war, the universal baseline standard for humane treatment of prisoners is Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions, which covers detained persons who do not have the status as prisoners of war or militarily occupied civilians. Common Article 3 states that such prisoners shall in all circumstances be treated humanely, and to this end, certain specified acts are and shall remain prohibited at any time and in any place whatsoever, including cruel treatment and torture and outrages upon personal dignity, in particular humiliating and degrading treatment. Violations of Common Article 3 are war crimes. And to go below the baseline, as the Bush administration did and justified in doing, undermines the very concept of the universal humanity. Now, following the 9/11 terrorist attack, the Bush administration declared a global war on terror. As is common in asymmetrical wars when states fight non-state groups, the lack of and the need for information about al-Qaeda elevated the importance of gathering actionable intelligence through interrogation of captured enemies. However, the authorization and the use of law-violating methods was a choice, not a necessity. Why did top officials make this choice? Because they believed that violent and dehumanizing interrogation tactics would be effective means of eliciting actionable intelligence. In other words, ignoring the abundance of contrary data and expert opinions, they chose to believe that torture can produce truth, and this truth would keep Americans safe. Contrary to Bush's recent claims that coercive interrogation, that's our euphemism of choice, worked and that they were adopted as a last resort, in fact, the torture policy was set in motion long before anyone had been taken into custody. It was the torture works mythology that drove policymaking. On September 17, 2001, that's 6 days after 9/11, Bush signed a memorandum of understanding granting the CIA the authority to establish a secret detention and interrogation operation overseas. The Clinton-era rendition program was revamped as extraordinary rendition to permit the CIA to kidnap people from anywhere in the world and disappear them into secret prisons, euphemized as black sites, where they could be held as ghost detainees or could be transferred extra legally to other states for interrogation, that is, torture by proxy. Contrary to Bush's claims that people disappeared by the CIA were picked up in battlefields, as he just stated again, in fact, some people were kidnapped from as far afield as the Gambia, Italy, Bosnia, and Macedonia. Now, unlike the CIA, the U.S. military is subject to the Geneva Conventions, which are enshrined in the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Nevertheless, by December 2001, Pentagon officials were exploring how to reverse engineer SEER techniques. SEER stands for Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Extraction. And these techniques had been developed during the Cold War to train elite U.S. soldiers to withstand torture in case they were captured by regimes that don't adhere to the Geneva Convention. So the Pentagon was reverse engineering these techniques. What distinguishes torture by liberal regimes from illiberal regimes is the energy devoted to framing government policies as legal. Vice President Dick Cheney and his legal counsel David Addington took charge of interrogation and detention policies, which were varnished with opinions by lawyers in the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel, OLC, most prominently by Berkeley law professor John Yoo, who worked as a deputy attorney general from 2001 to 2003. They devised what they called a new paradigm for waging the war on terror, based on a radical right-wing interpretation of Article 2 of the Constitution, according to which the president, as commander-in-chief, has unfettered power to wage war, and therefore any effort to constrain executive discretion in accordance with federal, military, or international law would be unconstitutional. On November 13, 2001, President Bush issued a military order declaring that captured terror suspects were, quote, unlawful combatants, a heretofore non-existent category conceived to place such prisoners outside of the law by claiming that they were neither combatants nor civilians and thus not privy to the standards of treatment for either. Anyone taken into U.S. custody could be designated an unlawful combatant by presidential fiat, rather than on the basis of any status review by a tribunal, and could be held incommunicado indefinitely. In other words, to be in custody was to be rightless and guilty. In the same order of November 13, 2001, Bush declared that such detainees could be prosecuted in a new kind of military commission, whose rules would admit coerced confessions, hearsay, and secret evidence. On January 11, 2002, the first unlawful combatants were transported to the detention facility at Gitmo. They were denounced to the public as the worst of the worst, and trophy photos of them bound and immobilized in physically straining positions and sensory deprivation gear were released for media publication. Gitmo had been selected because it was far from the hot war zone of Afghanistan, and more importantly, according to the new paradigmers, it was beyond the reach of U.S. courts and pesky lawyers. The coup de grace for the rule of law occurred secretly on February 7, 2002, when Bush issued a memorandum to his national security team endorsing the new paradigmers' claim that the Geneva Conventions are too quaint to apply to this novel form of global warfare against stateless enemies. And he asserted that captured terror suspects had no legal rights at all, but would be treated humanely, quote, as a matter of policy, with the caveat being that interrogation and detention policy would prioritize military necessity. The State Department had sharply criticized the legal flaws and political dangers of this position, but their criticism was ignored, and Secretary of State Colin Powell was cut out of the inner circle of prisoner policymaking. The claim that everyone at Gitmo was a terrorist is a lie that is still being peddled to the public. Intelligence officers, right in early 2002, were instructed to fill out a one-page form on every detainee, certifying the president's, quote, reason to believe that he was involved in terrorism. And they began reporting almost immediately that interrogations were not producing the information needed to fill out these simple forms. Pentagon and White House officials assumed the problem was that these hardened terrorists had been trained to resist and dissemble. But in August 2002, a senior Arabic-speaking CIA analyst was dispatched to Gitmo to do an assessment, and he concluded that at least half, and probably a much higher percentage, had no ties or meaningful information about al-Qaeda or the Taliban. He recommended a formal review process and noted that continued imprisonment and interrogation of innocent people could constitute war crimes. The National Security Agency's top lawyer scheduled a meeting to discuss the CIA analyst's recommendations, but Addington canceled the meeting, declaring, no, there will be no review. The president has determined that they are all enemy combatants. We're not going to revisit it. In the Division of Interrogational Labor, the CIA was vested with the primary responsibility for high-value detainees, or HVDs, people assumed to be terrorist leaders or planners of 9/11, or to have knowledge about terrorist plots and operations. HVD, Abu Zubaydah, was captured in Pakistan, i.e. not on a battlefield, and he was transported to a black site in Thailand. His interrogation led right away to a showdown between professional Arabic-speaking FBI interrogators who were using conventional methods with success to get information out of Abu Zubaydah, and unskilled CIA contractors. The CIA won, and the FBI stopped cooperating in black site interrogations. The escalating harshness of Abu Zubaydah's treatment was due to the amateur interrogator's frustration that he was not providing the actionable intelligence he was assumed to possess. But contrary to the initial claim that he was a top al-Qaeda strategist, in fact, he was more like a receptionist who had been responsible for moving people in and out of training camps in Afghanistan, which is why he'd been named by others under interrogation. The brutal and dehumanizing methods authorized for Abu Zubaydah, which included waterboarding him 83 times and placing him in a coffin-like confinement box with insects, which the lawyers made sure were not poisonous insects, set the stage for the CIA's secret interrogation program. By the midsummer of 2002, some agents were growing anxious about their vulnerability to future prosecution under federal anti-torture laws. In response to the agency's questions about legal liability, the OLC, and particularly John Yoo, produced two memos dated August 1, 2002. One memo interpreted the applicable definition of physical torture to exclude anything less than, quote, the pain accompanying serious physical injury, such as organ failure, impairment of bodily function, or even death. Anything less than that wasn't torture. And opined that cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment would not constitute mental torture unless it caused effects that lasted months or even years. The second memo provided legal cover for tactics already in use. Now, although these OLC memos were written for the CIA, the White House forwarded them to the Pentagon which was seeking a solution to military interrogators' frustrated efforts to get actionable intelligence out of Gitmo detainees. This confluence of radical legal reasoning and the ideologically driven presumption that all detainees are terrorists and that torture is effective in obtaining actionable intelligence meant that U.S. military interrogators, CIA agents, and government-hired contracts were, in effect, licensed by the Bush administration to utilize methods that were no longer regulated by the laws of this nation or the world. But the Bush administration never officially authorized torture. Rather, torture was the euphemism for anything that was not authorized. What was authorized, including stripping prisoners naked, short shackling them to the floor for protracted periods of time, forcing them to defecate and urinate on themselves, subjecting prisoners to days and weeks of sleep deprivation by bombarding them with constant light and or excruciatingly loud music or grating sounds and or extremes in temperature, weeks, months, or even years of isolation, stress positions such as long time standing, sometimes with arms extended outward, wall-hanging prisoners from hooks on the wall or ceiling, walling, which referred to bashing prisoners into walls, and waterboarding to induce the feeling and fear of death by drowning. The Bush administration's decision to take the war on terror to Iraq in 2003 had to be sold to the American public and skeptical allies. In early 2003, around January, CIA and military interrogators were under intense pressure to produce evidence that the regime of Saddam Hussein had an active weapons of mass destruction program and that there was a link between Iraq and 9/11. The actionable intelligence that the administration presented to make the case for war included a statement by a Libyan prisoner, Ibn Sheikh al-Libi, who said that Iraq had provided training in chemical weapons to members of al-Qaeda. However, al-Libi subsequently recanted this false claim that he had made to stop torture. By the late summer of 2003, the failure to find the non-existent WMD and the escalation of an anti-occupation insurgency had made a mockery of Bush's claim in May that the Iraq mission had been accomplished, and it created quite a political liability. So in August, the Pentagon sent the Gitmo commander to Iraq to provide advice on how to, quote, set the conditions to get actionable intelligence from the thousands of people, including women and children, who were being taken into custody in Iraq. The commander of the Iraq Theater of Operations signed off on a policy to Gitmoize Iraqi prisons, a euphemization for the use of dogs, sexual humiliation, stress positions, protracted sleep deprivation and isolation, and other forms of torture and cruel treatment. Despite the fact that up to 90% of the detainees were picked up in military sweeps or as a result of intra-Iraqi score settling and had no connection to the insurgency, let alone to al-Qaeda. On April 28th, shocking photos of naked, abused, humiliated, bloodied, and dead prisoners from the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq were published on CBS's 60 Minutes. And the context was provided by the simultaneous expose by Seymour Hersh in The New Yorker, which was based on the leaked, i.e. not meant for public release, report by Major General Antonio Taguba, which concluded that prisoner abuse was systematic and wanton, and that unlawful interrogation tactics linked Iraq to Afghanistan and Guantanamo. The Bush administration's initial reaction to the Abu Ghraib scandal was to blame bad apples, ostensibly acting autonomously. In other words, officials knowingly lied to the public. The Abu Ghraib scandal did, however, create political pressure for information. In June 2004, the first batch of legal memos and policy documents was declassified or leaked. These torture memos were, in their own way, at least as shocking as the photos because they exposed a pervasive disregard for the law. But there was no official denunciation of the program, as it was called. On the contrary, top officials asserted the prerogative to continue to use the use of, quote, coercive tactics as necessary and effective means of combating terror. Although Republicans lost control of the Senate in 2006, the combination of continuing executive secrecy and political partisanship enabled the torture policy to endure to the end of Bush's second term. Now, the torture policy was a failure in its own ostensible mission of eliciting accurate, actionable intelligence. By subjecting thousands of prisoners, most of whom were totally innocent, to violent and dehumanizing treatment, The quest for information and cooperation in critically important communities was as damned as America's reputation abroad. Under torture, some people revealed some information about al-Qaeda's structure and operations, but there is abundant evidence that has been verified in numerous reports that many tortured statements are false. Indeed, the American experience illustrates perfectly the ageless truism that some people will say anything to make torture stop. A worst-case example being al-Libi's false claims about a Saddam al-Qaeda connection, which is a tortured lie that has cost tens of thousands of lives and $1 trillion. David Rose, an investigative journalist who interviewed numerous counterterrorism officials from the U.S. and elsewhere, reported that their conclusions were unanimous. Quoting David Rose, not only have coercive methods failed to generate significant and actionable intelligence, they have also caused the squandering of resources on a massive scale, chimerical plots, and unnecessary safety alerts. A 2008 report by the bipartisan Senate Armed Services Committee rendered its own harsh judgment that the use of aggressive techniques, quote, damaged our ability to collect accurate intelligence that could save lives, strengthen the hand of our enemies, and compromised our moral authority. So what toll did the American people exact for revelations about a vast and ineffective use of torture? During the 2008 campaign season, the issue barely registered. But to their credit, both presidential candidates, Republican John McCain, who had pushed back on torture during his years in this, since 2005 and was a torture survivor, and Democrat Barack Obama, both of them vaunted their anti-torture credentials on occasion. While Obama campaigned on the promise to end torture, increase governmental transparency, and restore the rule of law, in order to demonstrate his aspirational post-partisanship, he squirted questions about accountability for the authors of the torture policy with the rhetoric of wanting to look forward, not backward. Obama's victory provided a hopeful moment for the rule of law restoration crowd. On his second day in office, he signed an executive orders requiring the CIA to adhere to the 2006 revised Army Field Manual for Human Intelligence Collector Operations and shuttering the black sites. He canceled the discredited military commissions, and he promised to close Gitmo within 1 year. But the administration quickly buckled because every initiative became fodder for partisan attacks that Obama was pandering to the far left. Influential advisors, in particular White House Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel, regarded the devotion of political capital to press the president's rule of law restoration promises as a loser for Democrats. Cheney, renowned for his secretive silence, became uncharacteristically voluble after he was out of office. In numerous interviews in 2009, he admonished the Obama administration for sacrificing security by relinquishing methods that work. Cheney's fact-free, pro-torture offensive found a receptive audience among America's chattering class, who seized the opportunity to engage in woolly speculations about the efficacy of torture and treated partisan historical revisionism as legitimate critique. Obama defensively asserted a post-partisan posture by contending that officials who had made the policy decisions and those who had followed orders had acted in good faith. And he conceded to right-wing arguments that any type of meaningful accountability, even a non-prosecutorial truth commission, would constitute a, quote, criminalization of policy differences. By the end of his first year in office, Obama had resurrected the military commissions, abandoned the promise to close Gitmo, authorized indefinite detention without trial for dozens of Gitmo prisoners, and asserted that people who were captured abroad and transported to the Bagram facility in Afghanistan have no habeas corpus rights and could be held incommunicado indefinitely, thus earning that facility the nickname Obama's Gitmo. The administration stepped into the defendant role in domestic lawsuits brought by victims of U.S. torture and replicated the stance of its predecessor, the Bush administration, by invoking state secrets to shut them down. And to date, almost all of the efforts of civil suits have been shut down. The ongoing national debate about torture, terror, and the law intensified following the 2009 Christmas Day attempt by Umar Farouk Abdulmutallab to detonate a bomb in his underwear while traveling on a transatlantic flight bound for Detroit. Right-wing critics excoriated Attorney General Eric Holder for allowing Abdul Muttalib to be read his Miranda rights and for not subjecting him to enhanced interrogation or shipping him off to Gitmo, despite that the Bush administration had followed an identical course of action with Richard Reed, the shoe bomber, and despite the fact that Abdul Muttalib readily provided information to FBI interrogators who were using conventional methods. In May 2010, following another failed attempt to detonate a bomb in Times Square, again Holder was condemned for providing constitutional protections to non-white terrorists arrested within the United States. That these events could be treated by so many officials and commentators as evidence of the need to subject suspects to torture should be unsurprising in a country that has failed to face the truth about the actual record of torture's inefficacy. The Obama administration's looking forward posture functions as a form of denial, and it has led inevitably to the need to rely on heavy-handed classification to block public access to information deleterious or embarrassing to the U.S. government. When the CIA's Office of Inspector General report was finally released in August 2009, excessive redactions made it impossible to glean how the torture program had grown and spread. The report by the Justice Department's Office of Professional Responsibility, which looked into the role of OLC lawyers in formulating torture policy, and which was completed even while the Bush was still in office, but was withheld without explanation until February 2010, contained substantial evidence that lawyers had colluded with the White House to legalize unlawful tactics. However, the official, David Margulies, who Holder had authorized to make the final judgment, concluded that the lawyers had merely exercised poor judgment and no consequences. And what of Obama's promises to end torture and close the black sites? In April 2010, the BBC reported testimonies of prisoners who said they had been subjected to beating, sexual humiliation, sleep deprivation, and isolation and stress and duress tactics at a secret facility in Kabul. The facility is not run by the CIA, but the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, which has secret authorization to use special interrogation methods detailed in a classified appendix to the Army Field Manual. When this news broke, Defense Department officials initially denied the existence of a secret facility. Later, they acknowledged its existence, but said that it's an interrogation facility, not a detention site, and therefore neither does the ICRC have right to access those held there, nor do regular interrogation rules apply. So, who cares about torture? Human rights and legal organizations have been at the forefront of investigating and condemning systematic abuses of prisoners, including the ACLU, which after 9/11 expanded its mandate to include international law and law violations by the U.S. government abroad. Protest activism by civil society groups like Witness Against Torture and the Ecumenical National Religious Campaign Against Torture has been determined but demographically marginal. However, nothing resembling an anti-torture social movement emerged. The American public has exacted no political price for torture, nor demonstrated any serious investment in the issue. Because those subjected to enhanced interrogation, quote unquote, and incommunicado detention are foreigner Muslims abroad, with a few non-white exceptions at home, no domestic constituency has been directly affected or immediately imperiled by the torture program, which helps explain the non-emergence of an anti-torture social movement. But equally important is the fact that the general public is too ignorant to formulate intelligent opinions, and their ignorance has been nourished by coverage in the mainstream media of specious torture works and worst of the worst arguments propounded by Bush, Cheney, and other torture enthusiasts. When it comes to American torture, the American people have failed to exercise their vaunted and fearsome democratic rights responsibly by demanding that their state rule right. Worse than that, the vast majority have bought into the liberal ideology of torture's necessity defense and subscribe to or accept the notion that critics are far leftists, un-Americans, or apologists for terror. Passivity, apathy, and ignorance about rights-violating practices of a state is common in many societies and has many causes, some unavoidable, like state secrecy being a prime example. But it is not normatively acceptable as long as democracy invests people with the right and the responsibility to determine how states rule. The more representative a state claims to be, and the more people believe themselves to be represented by the state that rules them, the greater their responsibility for the state's rights-violating practices. So torture by a military regime is deplorable, but torture by a democracy is inexcusable.
I'd be very interested if you could speak a little bit more about this torture by proxy process that you mentioned earlier about the black sites. I've heard a lot about this process, and I'm just curious about the current usage of it in the United States policy and a little prior history, a little bit background more on that. I think that's a major problem within the way the U.S. moved forward in its democracy.
In its democracy or its torture?
Well,
or its torture?
Moving forward toward becoming a more democratic society, more transparent, if they keep doing this.
Okay. Well, the belief, first of all, that brutal and dehumanizing tactics work was, sort of a crucial element in this issue. But there were even some things the CIA was unwilling to do. I mean, they were unwilling, perhaps, to electrically shock or cut the genitals of some detainees, which some other governments, intelligence services were willing to do. So the United States, essentially, among the countries that tortured for us, and the United States was in close, constant consultation with interrogators, includes, just to give a few examples, Morocco, which tortured a number of people, including the entirely innocent Binyam Mohammed, who is a British resident. He was arrested shortly after Abu Zubaydah. He was actually extraordinarily rendered to a number of places, but spent 18 months in Morocco, where he had his penis cut by Moroccan intelligence and had stinging liquid poured on it. Ultimately ends up in Guantanamo, subsequently back released because there's no evidence he was involved in torture. He's now suing the British government for their collusion with the Americans in his rendition. The case of Maher Arar, which is a very tragic case, an entirely innocent Canadian of Syrian origin, gets stopped while transiting through JFK Airport in 2002. The United States Attorney General John Ashcroft sends him to our tight ally Syria, where he is brutally tortured for a year in constant consultation with the United States. Ultimately, the Syrians realized that he's innocent. He's sent back. The Supreme Court just declined in June to allow his case to sue Ashcroft and other officials responsible for his torture. The case has been thrown out, but the Canadians have awarded him a $10 million compensation. Egypt is a common place where we use torture by proxy. Jordan, the Philippines has been a case, Thailand to some extent. And then there were places that we weren't using their agents, but there's sites in Europe which have their own issue. The United States had secret black sites in Poland, Romania, and Lithuania. And those countries, that's now creating a new problem for the United States because of the fact that on the territory of Europe, where there's strong international law enforcement mechanisms, the U.S. violated the laws of the region.
I agree, and I know this is asking you to speak about the counterfactual, but Abu Ghraib breaks in the media in
April 28, 2004.
Right. And, all right, so subsequent to that, we have case after case after case. Do you feel that the story simply doesn't play anymore simply because this framing of torture really is necessary? We're getting intelligence that we can't tell you about, but it was extremely necessary. Is there a sense that that simply doesn't play in the media, that there's no way of actually having an Abu Ghraib story appear again, not because it's not happening, but because the frame for how can we be a democracy and have torture stories, is that frame not available anymore, do you think? Or are we capable of being shocked anymore, I guess, is what I'm asking.
I think the appropriate question is are Americans capable of not being idiots anymore? That is a question the judge is still out.
But come to be shocked, I think, is the question, because even idiots can be shocked.
Yeah, well, honestly, on that score, I don't, but let me put it this way. Cheney, when he went on his fact-free pro-torture offensive, and particularly in the spring of 2009, when Obama decided to declassify additional very sort of damaging documents which actually bore specifically on what came out of those CIA interrogations. Before those documents were clarified, Cheney kept saying, well, the Obama administration is ending the tactics, but he's not proving to the American people all the great intelligence we got. Then the documents come out and in fact show that nothing came out of the CIA interrogation, like literally nothing. But then, of course, the Obama administration being reluctant to have the public be shocked has used redaction and secrecy as a means of allaying any possible capacity that some Americans of conscience may be able to have. So what we really need, actually, and the real democratic issue and the fact that there's no public mood for it, is a very serious truth commission, essentially, to really make bare all of these the information and so on. Because in that way, then let the people judge. But of course, the point is we already know what the contents of these things are. There's nothing but shameful error. I mean, it's not like one of those things where wow, the cup is half full. The torture cup is a completely empty, bone-dry cup of failure, which only public lying, like former President Bush and others, try to keep full with that half full.
I want to say something about a local context here. I think we're right to focus on the Obama administration's rejection of even a truth commission. Right? There's some profound discomfort with getting at the truth about these things and about disturbing people with it. And it happens at the state level with Obama, but in this town, on these campuses, the two times I can think of when we've had visits in the last couple of years from people who should have been asked direct questions. The vice president's daughters, one of whom ran his campaign, the other of whom was at the Middle East desk in the State Department while the United States was tortured. That visit was orchestrated to prohibit open questions at the forum at these colleges. The other example of that was Call Road. Again, that visit was orchestrated to prohibit open questions. Open questions of people who committed torture are very unpleasant and make for very unpleasant events. The word came from the donors who invited the vice presidents, who paid for the vice president's daughters to be here, that they wanted the daughters' visit to these campuses to be pleasant. That was the word that was quoted to me by one of the administrators organizing that event. And until we on these campuses also have to be willing to have unpleasant events, and not to keep those people from visiting the campus, but when they're here, to have open, direct questioning of them, rather than to allow there to be visits in which thereby, at the choice of the administrations on both campuses in those cases, allowing those visits to take place without open, direct questioning. And my own, dismay at our two campuses here that organized those events and blocked open, direct questioning, I think that was absolutely, the third week, all of us at that moment became complicit in torture.
And also, Liz Cheney has no knowledge, no experience. I mean, she's essentially on a keep my daddy out of jail campaign. I mean, she's just an amateur with a microphone. But, I mean, Cheney is another story, Rove is another story. So the fact that she's even given space on, Meet the Nation, it's like, really? I mean, on what basis?
Fortunately, we're engaged in the longest war in American history, but that raises, in Afghanistan, raises the interesting point that we are, at this point, critiquing the state in a time of warfare, which is a unique experience, and I think that we need to look on that as a very American, a very interesting and lucky, not lucky, but uncommon event is that most populations are controlled by their governments to the effect where they are not capable of critiquing the state during times of warfare, and that you might say that this is not really warfare, but we are told that it is imposed by the government. So it's interesting that we can conduct these type of symposiums in a time where we're technically at war.
Well, we haven't declared war.
Unfortunately, we're in a time when there's no universal draft. But the book I'm actually working on now is focusing mainly on anti-torture lawyering. It's the lawyers who've been dealing with it. Because in fact, a larger point of my thing is that the American people are simply, these issues are too complicated for just, the general public. And the people who have cared about them and who've actually effectively been able to do something are lawyers. And particularly what's been fascinating is military lawyers. I mean, military lawyers pushed back even while the torture policy was still quite secret. A number of military lawyers have been really intently involved in these things, including but not limited to those who have signed on or been signed on to defend people at Guantanamo. And in my interviews with them, so, I sort of would talk with them, many of these people, would sort of say, I was like a dyed-in-the-wool, right-wing Republican, I joined the Army, love my country, totally patriotic, and who have, by the sort of what they've seen of this torture policy and the lying the government has done to the public, have lost their innocence. I mean, so it's one thing for the kind of crunchy granola, Birkenstock wearing, I Heart Amnesty International types to be critical, but to see people, corporate Republican lawyers who are like, Rockefeller Republican types, military lawyers, et cetera, who have really come to be shocked. And what you find is that it's these lawyers and legal intellectuals and persons of kindness, I would include that as a broader category, but who not only are they so appalled by what's been done, but that, this talk that I gave today, none of this stuff is secret, this is all out there, but it's like there's a group of people who know this stuff and just can't believe that Bush is like back in the news a week ago trotting lies that have been discredited for, 6 years, and it's being gobbled up or treated as like, well, are we having a national debate? What is there to debate? And so it's that, what I call it is the lonely elitism, people who actually know about this stuff, and, just the general public. And so it's a really, I think that in itself is a kind of compounds the frustration of the people who are actually fighting for the rule of law.
I'm going to take 2 more questions and then move us into the roundtable. Stu and then Nigel.
Okay. You mentioned in passing in answer to the last question, we don't have a universal draft. And if you want to talk about people not knowing stuff, one of the reasons they don't know stuff is that they haven't been there. They don't know people who've been there. There's a sort of a bubble effect of people who are in the military lawyers included, who, whatever they think about it, they actually are informed about what's happening in places like Gitmo or Munroe or elsewhere. And, before we say, the American people are just ignorant, they're not informed and they don't care very much, partly because they're not connected to it. I can think of previous instances of overseas torture. The revelations that came out of the Church Commission in the 1970s, the slow war on Cuba that's happened over the last, there are many outrages that the United States has committed in other parts of the world, which Guatemala, we could go on a long list, which the American people also don't care about, right? Because
they're not discriminating in their ignorance.
Well, those are foreigners, right? That's happening to somebody else. But when you talk about what is this doing to the United States, then people get interested. So they were actually, in some ways, there was more outrage over the revelation that Bush was wiretapping American communications than there was over the really horrible stuff that was going on in Abu Ghraib, because that was happening to people in the United States. There were congressional hearings about that. So, one of the root problems here may be that you're fighting a war, and now that's going on almost a decade, with a very select, small subset of the American population. And that's what then allows the discourse to take the form that it does, and makes politicians, even like Barack Obama, who said all the right things during the campaign, gun-shy. Because, where's the political payoff in making a pitch about the rights of foreigners? They don't vote in American elections.
But even sort of the rule of law, much as I loathe Rahm Emanuel, I'm very happy to see him go be Chicago's mayor or whatever. It's like he was absolutely.
He may not even win that.
Okay, but he was absolutely right. There is no constituency that matters that cares about the rule of law. And that's a disgrace, and he's absolutely right. It's a loser. Americans are ignorant and apathetic, and this is their consequence. So.
Question and then a comment. The question is, it strikes me that your argument about why liberal states torture and then concoct this ideology to cover this is that it rests on a mistaken belief that torture gets intelligence. But isn't the reason that liberal states torture political rather than anything to do with intelligence? It's not so much the specific intelligence they might get, the 1970s. So, Spanish socialist governments in the 1980s did these exact same things in response to terrorist conflicts in those places.
Yes. No, absolutely. I think that there's different reasons why states, I mean, first of all, the question of liberal torture is like, is a state a liberal democracy? Or is state policy being enacted in the interest of some, public greater good as opposed to authoritarian regime? But there are different reasons why states will engage in torture. Certainly in some cases where there's like an internal sort of somewhat of a civil war in Spain, in the case of Spain, or in the case of the IRA in Britain. I mean, there was that sense of a bit of the sort of punitive reprisal attitude. In the case of Israel, which I know very well, I mean, the reason that Israel used moderate physical pressure for decades was essentially because in order to govern the West Bank and Gaza, the military court system was an essential institution, and in order to ensure that people could get convicted, they could be convicted on the basis of confession. So Israel didn't care if the confessions were true or not. The confessions had a certain, unfightable aspect. So torturing for confessions for prosecution for imprisonment was an Israeli strategy for maintaining control of the West Bank and Gaza, which is different than the case of kidnapping people, around the world for CIA black sites. So we have to break it out. To what extent is a state liberal, and sort of what's the national security agenda for those types of things, and then why are they torturing? I mean, we, originally, the fact that we've tortured so many people, including Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, makes it very difficult now for us to actually prosecute the people who are actually responsible for 9/11. I mean, that's why the government is stalling, because it'll be hell when they try to put, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who's self-declared perpetrator of 9/11, would be perfectly happy to be martyred immediately if the United States would just execute him. But to put him on trial means it comes out that he was waterboarded 183 times. And so that is the reason why the government isn't willing to even move forward. So we thought that we want to, have justice. I mean, Bush had declared bringing these people to justice, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, and torture has fouled that prospect. And it's given us no intelligence. But presumably, Cheney will always say we weren't thinking about prosecuting people, we just wanted intelligence. They just never got any.
We're going to reconstitute, and you'll take your first chance.
Well,
Okay,
just pressing a little more on this notion that it was faith in the efficacy of torture for the acquisition of intelligence that drove the term of torture in 2002 and onward.
Yeah.
It's always fascinating to me that the Bush administration rejected interrogation expertise from the beginning, suggesting, based on Michael's comment, that something else was going on as a motivation for using harsh interrogation, more than just desire for the acquisition of intelligence, but punishment, anger, frustration.
Yeah, I think it was anger, clearly, but coupled with this muscular ignorance. And Cheney was the one who talked about the dark side, 5 days after 9/11. And Cofer Black comes to Congress and says, on September 21st, there's a before 9/11 and after 9/11. After 9/11, the gloves come off. I mean, they already wanted to take the gloves off because they believed that they could and that it would work. And that was on September 21st, 2001.
I am going to take one more question up there, but also before, to Jeffrey's point, though, it's also interesting, you're talking about them rejecting the expertise, but they're also very happily wanting psychologists at the torture as experts, validating what they're doing, and
but they want people who have experience in interrogation.
And clearly not wanting the American Psychological Association to condemn that, and the American Psychological Association avoids condemning it over an extended period of time. So, there you see an investment in expertise.
Well, my understanding of why the doctors and psychologists there is to ensure that the interrogating techniques can go to the physical and mental limits of improvement, not beyond.
My understanding of the relationship to the psychologists was that there was a pretense of efficacy in relationship to the psychologist.
Yeah, but the the psychologists they really brought in had no experience with
Yes,
interrogation.
but, so I said the pretense
Yeah,
stuff
exactly, right. They've already
is
amateur.
my
I
understanding.
think this discussion gets to a deeper debate about
Which hopefully we're going to take one more question, then I'm going to ask all of our speakers and our two discussants to come on up.
To what extent do you think it's just the American public that is ignorant about these things? Because it seems to me that the executive branch is having such a control on the government that even our congressmen and our senators don't really know what's going on. So,
Oh, indeed. Oh, I think it's like it goes, in democracy you get the government you deserve. And so I think that in part this is, you know, the lack of, there's no pushing either way. I mean, leaders could lead if they want, you know, if they were willing for, you know, to look into what this has done and adverse consequences it's done. They've refused to lead. They've taken, in other words, like anyone who wants to close Gitmo is a far leftist, you know, soft on terror type, and the public has let them get away with it. So there's no, either the public could lead and make certain demands on its elected officials, or its elected officials could play a more conventional leadership role, and they failed across the board.